are here as men of peace, that we are here also to declare our full and forthright support of what is in great measure a military alliance.
But in the background is a much wider and more suggestive question connected with the fact that Canada seems to have moved from a pre-national to a post-national phase of existence without ever having been a nation.
That bigness and complexity are functions not so much of numbers as of ideas.
We built a country, east and west and north. We built it on an infrastructure that deliberately resisted the continental pressure of the United States. For 120 years we've done it with one signature of a pen. You've reversed that, thrown us into the north-south influence of the United States.
Hello and welcome to the second edition of the Red Ensign Special. For the next couple of weeks, you're going to be stuck with me solo and recorded until I get my internet into better condition. So get used to it. We're stuck this way. But I wanted to do a piece looking at 3 issues that have been highlighted on the online right over the last couple of weeks. All of which, well, 2 of them are not directly Canadian issues, but are certainly active in Canada. And the third is a Canadian issue. All of them relate to the interaction between the managerial class and the right constituents of organizations. And I think you'll see how they all tie together. And the way in which they illustrate the point that addressing the issues which plague Canada requires a deeper set of solutions than simply replacing the politicians in control of Parliament. So without further ado, we'll have a look, and then we'll try to draw this together as we come to a conclusion. The first issue I want to address here relates to the relationship between the corporate oligarchy, which has a great deal of influence in politics in all countries within the quote-unquote rules-based international order, and the social capital of the countries in which they operate. Friend of mine, academic agent, released a video relatively recently called Capitalism Causes Immigration and Feminism. And the argument that he made is that capitalism, i.e. the corporate oligarchy that forms a substantial power block within countries within the rules-based international order, and he defines capitalism that way because that's capitalism as actually instantiated, not capitalism as constructed from some theoretical framework. And his argument is that it causes mass immigration and it causes feminism. And the argument here is relatively simple, that the private interests of the private short and medium term interests of that corporate oligarchy override the long-term constituent interests of the body politic because of the way that the structure of government operates. And he uses immigration and feminism as his 2 issues to kind of make the point. But the point, I think, is actually broader than immigration and feminism, and it could be applied to a whole collection of ways in which that system of governance prioritizes the short and medium term interests of the corporate oligarchy over the long-term interests of the body politic. I think you could make a very similar argument to why, for example, for the reasons for pursuing the kind of U.S. imperial project. Very similar arguments apply there as apply to immigration and feminism. And in support of this argument, we saw a number of news stories illustrating this point just this week. So we saw this week ICE, the U.S. Border Control Agency, raided a construction site uh, building a Hyundai plant in Georgia, and in that raid, they found 450 illegal aliens working on the site. If it's like many comparable job sites, essentially the entire job is being done by an army of illegal migrants. If we turn our eyes towards Canada, immediately following Pierre Poilievre's call to end the temporary foreign workers program, Mark Carney replied by saying that the number 2 issue that corporate Canada speaks to him about, besides dealing with the tariffs, is access to temporary foreign workers as a source of labor. Now, there's a number of reasons for this. Temporary foreign workers and international workers more broadly represent a subsidized labor pool for corporate Canada. In other words, the migrants look at their compensation as inclusive of both the things they get from the government of Canada, and many of these resettlement programs have substantial financial incentives or implicit incentives like free places to work, or implicit incentives like access to Canadian healthcare for the period of time that they're here, or for their family for the period of time that they're here. And so in addition to whatever financial compensation they're getting from their employer. So if you look at it from the perspective of the migrant, in many cases, a great majority of the value in participating in the program is not actually the dollars they get from Tim Hortons or whoever is engaging the TFW program. It's the money that they're going to get out of the government of Canada in the form of services during the period they're here. And you can see the kind of deep relationship between corporate Canada and the TFW program if you spend any time looking at how these employees are engaged. Somebody put up a website mapping where all of these employees are employed, and if you get outside of the big urban centers, the map is actually essentially a map of fast food locations through the province of Ontario. I'm sure it's very similar elsewhere, but it's a map not of places where employers are getting access to employees that don't exist in Canada. It's a map of places employing employees at wage rates that are below what you could get even Canadian teenagers to work for. And they're getting employees through the TFW program to work at those wages, not because people from elsewhere are so desperate for jobs that they're willing to do it, but because of this massive implicit subsidy of access to the Canadian welfare state programs during the period of time that they're here, or maybe access for their children. If their children are born while they're TFWs in Canada, then they'll get Canadian citizenship, or blah, blah, blah. There's a whole myriad of ways in which these temporary foreign workers are getting compensated by the government of Canada in addition to whatever compensation they get from their employer. So you can kind of see how this relationship works. The TFW program is a program which is obviously bad for Canada. It obviously erodes the social capital of the country, and obviously benefits the kind of private interests of the members of the corporate oligarchy that are making profits on the back of it. They're essentially transferring the value of the social capital that they're destroying into their private hands as cash. Really, really just disgusting use of political power. So that's kind of issue number one that I wanted to draw at. Issue number two deals more explicitly with the dynamics within the corporate world. A friend of mine, Ryan Turnipseed, wrote an article over at the Old Glory Club Substack, where he made the argument that the Cracker Barrel rebrand, which is kind of a high-profile example of managerialism serving the left in American politics. Managerialism, in this case, in the context of private corporations. He made what I think is actually quite an interesting and subtle argument about the way that the abstraction away from the profit motive is actually driving this. And some of this will be Turnipseed's argument, some of this will be my argument, but bear with me while I explicate this a bit. So the basic piece here is the rebrand of Cracker Barrel as kind of a generic left-wing corporation was obviously not in the economic interests of Cracker Barrel. The stock crashed the next day. There's a huge consumer action as a result of it. This isn't the first time we've seen this. We've seen this over and over and over again. And the argument that is always put forward to explain why this is that rebranding these corporations or steering them left is in the private interests of the management of the corporation, but not in the interests of the shareholders of the corporation. And so they're drawing attention to this, to the fact that even inside the so-called private world, power inside the countries within the sort of rules-based international order is concentrated with the managers and not with the ownership class. And Turnipseed attempts to make the argument that the reason why this is the case is that the efforts to shield the corporate, or to diversify the corporation's objectives beyond the profit motive, have given cover to all these managers to do whatever they want. And the point is well made, but I think it's worth reflecting on why and how this happened. It's not a coincidence that, or like an inevitable historic. So if you read James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution, he presents the takeover of Western societies by managers as like an inevitable progression in the social evolution of what he refuses to call Christendom, but what is really Christendom. And he's arguing in the sort of form of a Marxist analysis. Marx would have said that the next inevitable step in the historical progression of Christendom, it was a workers' revolution, and Burnham says no, that's not the next inevitable historical step. Instead, it's this managerial takeover. I would posit that it's not correct to say that the inevitable forces of history caused this. There are specific causes that have existed in these nations for the period in question that have caused this managerial takeover of private corporations. And I think they're really interesting to examine, because I think if we expect to get a better result as a result of social reformation, we need to kind of understand what these problems are and understand how they can be controlled, understand how they might be realigned. So I would formulate this as having at least 4 basic causes. The first cause is that the larger and more complex an organization is, the more things it does, the more abstract the profit motive is, right? The harder it is to define what action. So if you've got a corporation, if you've got like a bakery with 20 employees, it's very easy to identify what is in the economic interests of that bakery, and whether they're in the kind of immediate profit this day interest, or whether they're in its economic interest in terms of the long-term capital value of the company, right? Buying a new oven might not be good for today's P&L line, but it certainly might be good for the capital value of the asset that you have. The larger and more complex the organization is, the more difficult it is to determine whether any given action is in the interests of the organization's owners. So the larger the organization is, the more scope there is for managers to claim that their self-interested actions are actually in the interest of the organization, right? I'm not imposing this stupid HR policy because it's in my personal private interest. I'm imposing this stupid HR policy because it's in the interest of this organization not to be sued, and this is how we do it best. And so, and by the way, we're imposing it across 6,000 employees. Think about how terrible 6,000 lawsuits would be, and blah, 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 right? We've all seen exactly how this works in large organizations. The more abstract the relationship between the policy and the P&L drive of the business, the harder it is to make any countervailing argument that actually the costs outweigh the benefits of this action, and you're just being a self-interested prick. So that's one piece. The next piece is that the more diverse the ownership of the corporation, the less that ownership is engaged in the day-to-day activities of the business, the less effective they are at holding management accountable to their fiduciary duty. So what is supposed to prevent organizations like Cracker Barrel from blowing up their business on some stupid rebrand is that management has a fiduciary duty to maximize the value of the business that they're operating. And management is supposed to be hired, fired, disciplined by ownership, whether that's an individual owner, whether that's a board of directors representing public owners, in order to keep those they're supposed to be hired, fired, and disciplined in order to do this by ownership somehow. And the larger and more diverse the ownership, the more significant the board of directors becomes, right? So if it's a single owner, then the board of directors is basically irrelevant. Whatever the single owner says ultimately goes. But if you've got a public company where the owners are a diverse class that don't really have any way of supervising the day-to-day activities of the business and don't really have an effective line to management, really the board of directors is supposed to represent their interests and enforce discipline on management. But the board of directors don't have the more diverse the ownership of the company, the less the board of directors have any actual accountability to the owners. And so if you think about a public company that's got thousands, maybe millions of owners who all own a tiny piece of the company, it is almost impossible for those shareholders to enforce their claimed fiduciary duty upon management via the proxy of the board of directors. The only enforcement mechanism they have is the legal system, and the number of cases of the legal system attacking a board of directors for breach of fiduciary duty in the last 100 years, I could maybe name on one hand the number of non-fraud cases where that's been the case. So that's a really big issue. The third really big issue is that the tax code throughout all Western societies incentivizes corporations to retain earnings inside the corporation rather than distribute them to the shareholders, which makes it, and to retain them inside this complicated structure that often spans borders. The net effect of that is to make it much, much more difficult to assess whether any actions of management are in the interest of the shareholders or whether they're self-serving for management, because $1 of retained earnings is much easier for management to spend on whatever their stupid pet project is than $1 that they've distributed out via dividends to the shareholders and then have to go to the shareholders and ask for new investment, right? So the mechanics of this are such that the more earnings are retained, the more you can get Amazon with its pet studio project that never makes any money. The fourth piece of this is the way that the relationship with insurance externalizes even from the organization the policy. So one of the things that management will do in order to um, in order to well, one of the things that happens in large organizations is that public liabilities of various kinds get insured for, and then the policy that the insurance company comes up with around the issue becomes the policy of the corporation, right? So the line between the economic interests of the owners of the corporation and the actions of the corporation is further obscured by this proxy. So not only are they operating from the owner to the board to the management, they're now operating from the owner to the board to the management out to the insurance company, and then the insurance company's management is going to decide the policy. You see this in like almost all the stupidest policies you'll encounter in the workplace come as a result of of insurance companies making blanket policy to try to reduce the public liability of the corporation. Okay, why do I go through all of this? Well, all of these structures are barriers to correcting the natural incentives of the managerial system toward the kind of oligarchical, kind of left-wing, individualist society that we've created. All of these problems are going to have to be addressed in order to prevent a major political reform from drifting right back into this position over time, right? So you've seen this repeatedly where Western countries have used populist energy to elect leaders that promise to restore the nation. And maybe they have some success over time, for a time, but then the nations drift back into this identical position. Well, they don't drift back into this identical position by random chance. There are some force mechanisms that cause them to drift back into this position. Things like USAID that finance the movement of these nations back into this orientation. But they also move into this position because of the logic of power connected with making the management layer of the corporate oligarchy the center of political power in society, right? So this system and all of these incentive problems that exist that Ryan's talking about, that I've talked about on this stream, all need to be addressed and transformed in order to get a healthier instantiation of government, right? There are a lot of ways that you might be able to do that. You might be able to do that by changing the ruling class from maybe the merchant oligarchy to maybe the martial class of a society. You might be able to change it by simply pressing the reset button, clearing away, like having a disruptive event that starts the iterative process of leftward drift over again. There's lots of things you might be able to do, but when we look at the situation that we're all stuck in, it's important to understand the underlying dynamics that are actually creating it, rather than just call for a sweep solution. So that's that point. The third, again, closely related item that I want to draw attention to is the continued drift of the Canadian medical bureaucracy toward eliminating its cost problem by eliminating expensive people. So this week, the Canadian Medical Association has decided that it's okay to kill babies who are disabled in the period shortly following birth, right? So we know that the Canadian medical system has a whole series of standardized tests designed during the natal period, designed to inform parents of chronic disease that a baby might have as early as possible in the pregnancy, in order to facilitate the abortion of these children, right? So if you go through standard procedure from an OBGYN in the natal procedure, they will do tests, both ultrasounds and genetic tests, designed to inform you as early as possible in the pregnancy of lifelong conditions that your baby might have, with the kind of expressed intent that it gives you an opportunity to abort the child, right? That's how that system is set up. Nobody will tell you that's why it's set up, but these tests are completely unnecessary, except to inform the parent so that they might not so that any intervention can be conducted, not so that the baby can be healthier, but so that the parent might more comfortably dispose of the child rather than live with the burden of a disabled child. And this is an extension of this program. You can see this mentality throughout Canadian medicine. The fastest growing cause of death in Canada is medical assistance in dying, mostly of elderly people who have chronic diseases. You can see as of 2022, it was the fifth medical assistance in dying was the fifth leading cause of death in Canada. And it's uncertain now, but it's estimated that in 2024, it will come in as the third leading cause of death behind cancer and heart disease. You can see here the same underlying dynamics at work. In many ways, a society is morally defined by the way it cares for the weakest and most vulnerable, with compassion and humanity, and offering them dignity befitting of their position as members of that society. This is not like an anti-eugenic argument. It's not like these people are having children and slowly damaging the gene pool or something silly like this. People who a good society is partly defined because people who are weak and can't care for themselves are well cared for, and treated with dignity and respect. And yet, if you look at the bureaucratic incentives inside the medical apparatus in Canada and inside, and even kind of higher up the chain in terms of the Canada managed as like a business entity, as a tax annuity on the revenue side and as an obligation for care on the other side, you can see very clearly how, if you're managing Canada as a tax farm, this is the policy you would want to pursue, rather than as a people, this is the policy that you would want to pursue. But those of us who think of Canada as a people, Canada as a nation, Canada with dignity in itself, understand and are repulsed by this way of treating our own. The common thread that links these three stories is this particular structure where there's no sense of ownership of the people, as so Cicero said, Salus, Populi, Suprema lex. The health or well-being of the people is the supreme law. Now, the key question inside that formulation is, what is the representation of the health and well-being of the people? Well, in the managerial perspective that kind of is embodied by our ruling class, the health and well-being of the people is a meaningless concept to be manipulated for the self-interests of each layer of the managerial class. Whereas what I'd really like to see is the health and well-being of the people placed in a consistent moral framework that spans the whole of society, right? Where it's understood that there's no room to interpret the health and well-being of the people as inclusive of all the random people that we might add to the population to improve the corporate profits of Tim Hortons. Where it's understood that the health and well-being of the people cannot be reinterpreted to mean their psychological well-being. So we're going to give them as many antidepressants as possible so that they feel like they're happy and disguise their miserable, meaningless lives. Where the health and well-being of the people cannot be reinterpreted by the medical bureaucracy to mean that their subjective experience of pain doesn't justify their life, and so we should either preemptively or reactively kill them. There needs to be a common, consistent vision for what the well-being of the people looks like for every person in the society, from the lowest of the low all the way to the top of the great chain of being. For every role to have a positive, asserted role, a positive, asserted vision for how they can contribute to the greatness of the whole. And without that vision, what you're going to get, and without that vision being held together in a non-managerial figure, somebody who has a sense of ownership over the whole of society, not a sense of a private obligation within a managerial system, you're going to continue to get this kind of nonsense. All right. Those are the three stories I wanted to link together today, bring to your attention, discuss. Let me know in the comments what you thought about this discussion, and whether you'd like to see more videos like this, or whether I really urgently need to address my technical situation so I can get guests back. Thank you very much.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.